There is a piece of music almost everyone has heard. A waltz, 3 beats to the bar. It rises, turns, and settles again, the way a river is supposed to move. Johann Strauss wrote it in 1867. He called it the Blue Danube. For most of the world, that is the river, a blue ribbon through old cities, a name painted on the side of a cruise ship, a castle on a hill, reflected in slow water. The postcard is not wrong. It is just very small. Because the river in the song does not spend its days being beautiful. It works. The same water that carries the tourists cools nuclear reactors. It turns a ladder of turbines strung across 4 countries. It fills the taps of a capital city, not from the surface, but from the gravel beneath its own banks. And it moves cargo, the weight of 100 trucks in a single hull, from one sea to another, without ever touching a road. 2,850 kilometers, from a spring in a German forest to a marsh on the Black Sea. 10 countries drink from it, border it, or live off it. No river on earth touches more. 4 national capitals sit on its banks: Vienna, Bratislava, Budapest, Belgrade. Again, more than any river anywhere. Its wider basin reaches into 19 countries and holds close to 80 million people. And almost none of them think about the number that holds it all up. There is a single figure, measured every day at 100 quiet points along the water. Cubic meters per second. The flow. It is not on any postcard. It is not in the waltz. But when that number moves, the power of several countries moves with it. This is a river Europe has quietly wired into itself. Its electricity, its drinking water, its grain. And a machine that large only shows itself on the day it is asked for something it cannot give. So this is not, really, a story about a river. It is a story about a system. How one thread of water came to carry so much, and what happens the day it runs thin. How does a single river keep the power on for a continent? And what, in the end, is the whole thing standing on? Start with the power, because that is the promise in the question. Strung along this one river are dozens of power stations, a staircase of hydroelectric dams climbing back toward the Alps, 2 nuclear plants that cool themselves directly in the current, coal and gas furnaces drawing the same water to cool the same steam, whole national grids in several countries leaning on the flow of a single river. Take the river away and the turbines stop, the reactors overheat, and the lights of more than one country begin to dim. That is not a figure of speech. It is a wiring diagram. The power stations, quite literally, cannot live without it. The question is how one river came to carry that much, and what it means that all of it rests on a number that answers only to the weather. It begins with almost nothing. In the Black Forest, in the far southwest of Germany, 2 small streams meet, the Brigach and the Breg. They join near a town called Donaueschingen, and from that meeting, the water takes a new name. For the first stretch, it is a modest thing. Shallow, clear, a river you could wade across without wetting your knees. Then it does something strange. Near the town of Immendingen, on many days of the year, the young Danube runs over a bed of limestone and simply drains away. The water slips into cracks and sinkholes in the rock and vanishes from the surface. It does not end there. It moves underground, through the stone, and rises again about 12 kilometers away, in a spring called the Ach. But the Ach does not run to the Black Sea. It runs the other way, into the Rhine and out to the North Sea. So before the Danube is even properly a river, part of it leaks across an invisible line, the divide between two of Europe's great water systems, and surfaces in the wrong ocean. It is the first sign of what this water is. Not a line on a map, a thing that travels through the ground as much as over it, doing work you cannot see. Hold on to that. The Danube spends a great deal of its life underground, out of sight, quietly holding something up. By the time it reaches the German city of Passau, the river has grown, and here it meets the Inn. The Inn comes down from the Alps, pale green with meltwater and ground rock. At the exact point where the two rivers join, the Inn is carrying more water than the Danube itself, which raises a quiet contradiction. At that seam, the tributary is the larger river. The Danube, by the plain measure of water, is the smaller stream that simply keeps its name. But it does keep it. Below Passau, the whole flow is called the Danube. The Inn folded in, its name surrendered. This is how the river is built. Not from one source, but from hundreds. Around 300 tributaries feed it along its length. More than 30 are large enough to float barges of their own. Two of them, the Sava and the Tisa, arrive so heavy with water that below their mouths the river more than doubles. The Danube you see at any single place is really a sum, the total of every mountain and plain that drains toward it. An accounting, arriving. It gathers cities the way it gathers water. Ulm, where the cathedral spire climbs higher than any church tower in the world. Regensburg, where the Romans laid a stone fort and named it Castra Regina, because even 2,000 years ago, this was a line you had to hold. The Danube was the frontier of an empire once, the edge of the ordered world, with a current standing in for a wall. When the empire fell, the river stayed useful. It had always been the easiest road in a roadless world. At Regensburg, in the 12th century, they threw a bridge of stone across it. 16 arches standing for 800 years, a wonder of its age. Crusades crossed it. Salt and cloth and silver crossed it. The city on its banks grew rich, not from what it made, but from where it sat. On the water, at the crossing, taking a cut of everything that passed. This is the oldest thing the Danube ever did. Before the turbines, before the reactors, it moved the weight of a continent. Grain down from the plains, salt up from the mines, timber, ore, wine, stone. A single current doing the work of 10,000 carts. The cargo has changed, the principle has not. To this day, more tonnage moves on this water than most people on its banks would ever guess. And it moves for the same reason it always has. Water does not tire, and it does not charge by the mile. Then the great cities begin in earnest. Vienna, Bratislava, Budapest, Belgrade. 4 capitals on one river, within a few hundred kilometers of each other. A closeness no other river can claim. And it is around Vienna that the Danube stops being scenery and becomes visibly a machine. Here the water is put to work turning turbines. To understand how, you have to look at the shape of the ground. The upper Danube falls fast. Down from the Alps, the bed drops steeply. A strong current. A great deal of energy running downhill and going nowhere. In the middle of the last century, engineers looked at that falling water and saw a resource lying idle. So they began to build. Along the Danube's first 1,000 kilometers, from the source down to a dam in Slovakia, they raised 59 barriers across the river. 59. Which means that on that upper stretch, the Danube is stopped on average every 16 kilometers. Dam, reservoir, the whole way down. Very little of the upper river still runs free. Austria alone operates 9 power plants on its share of the water. Each is a low dam with turbines set into it. The river backs up behind the wall, then drops through the machines, and every drop becomes current. A large part of the country's electricity comes from this one river, step by step, down a staircase of water. But a dam on the Danube is rarely just a dam. Look closely at one of the Austrian steps, at Freudenau, the plant that sits inside the city of Vienna itself, or at Altenwörth, the largest in the country. Each is really 3 machines built into one wall. The first is the powerhouse, the turbines that take the falling water and make current. The second is the weir, a row of great steel gates that can be raised or lowered to let a flood pass through without wrecking the works. The third is a log, a water lift for ships, because a wall that makes power is also a wall that blocks the river. And a blocked river cannot be sailed. So beside every power dam sits a chamber with gates at both ends. Barge enters. The gate closes behind it. The water inside rises or falls to match the level on the far side. The second gate opens and the ship carries on, lifted over the dam like a parcel passed hand to hand. So the same structure does 3 jobs that pull against one another. It makes electricity, it holds back floods, and it carries traffic over itself. Every dam on the river is a negotiation between those 3, written in concrete. There is a hidden cost to running a river this way, and it hides in the rhythm of the day. A city needs the most electricity at certain hours, morning when it wakes, and evening when it comes home. So the dams send more water through their turbines at those hours and hold it back in between, which means the river below them no longer runs at a steady level. It pulses. It rises in the morning and falls at night, not with the rain, but with the switching on of lights and kettles in the cities. They call it hydropeaking, a tide with no moon behind it. A rise and fall in a natural river timed to the demand of a power grid. The fish in the shallows are stranded when the water drops. The banks are scoured when it climbs. The river breathes now to a clock set by the people using it. This is the quiet truth of the upper Danube. It looks like a river. It behaves like a machine. Its level, its speed, even its daily rhythm are set not by the weather alone, but by a control room deciding hour by hour how much power the day requires. The staircase reaches its largest step downstream of Bratislava, at a place called Gabčíkovo. Gabčíkovo is the second largest dam on the entire river, and it runs on a hard trick. The engineers did not simply block the Danube where it lay. They dug a new channel beside the old one, an artificial river, straight and wide. Then they moved the water into it. Today, the natural bed keeps only 1/10 to 1/5 of the flow. The rest, 80 to 90% of the Danube, runs down the man-made canal, falls through 8 turbines, and generates roughly 1/10 of all the electricity in Slovakia. But water taken from one place is water missing from another. The old channel, robbed of most of its river, began to change. Beside it lay one of the largest wetlands in the region, a maze of sidearms and floodplain forest that lived on the river spilling into it. As the main flow was pulled into the canal, the groundwater under the wetland dropped. The sidearms dried. In some years, they carried moving water for barely 19 days. To keep the forest alive at all, they now feed it by hand. They release water through gates and irrigate 8,000 hectares of woodland deliberately, as though it were a field of crops, because the river that used to do it for nothing had been sent somewhere else. This is the first thing the machine teaches. Every part of it is joined to every other part. You cannot borrow the river's power without taking something the river was already doing. Carrying sediment, filling a marsh, feeding a well. Move one thing and something downstream goes quiet. And there is a further story behind that diverted river, one that shows how heavy a shared river can become. Gabčíkovo was never meant to stand alone. The plan, agreed decades ago between the two countries on this stretch, was for two dams working as a pair. One here, in what is now Slovakia, and a second downstream in Hungary, at a town called Nagymaros. Together, they would have formed a single machine. The upper dam would store the water. The lower one would smooth it back out. Neither made full sense without the other. Then the partnership broke. Hungary, facing deep objection at home over what the second dam would do to the river, halted its half and walked away from the plan. And Slovakia was left holding an upstream dam built for a downstream partner that no longer existed. So it chose to finish alone. It built the Great Diversion, the artificial canal that pulled the river out of its bed, to make the machine work by itself. But that river was a border. To divert it, one country had reshaped a river the other country also lived on. The two nations took the dispute to the highest court there is, at The Hague. The court gave its ruling, and still, decades on, the practical questions it raised have never fully settled. The river runs down its concrete channel. The old bed lies mostly dry. And the argument over what one country may do to a river that belongs in part to another, that has no clean ending. It is the lesson of the machine again in its hardest form. On a river shared by many, there is no such thing as a purely local decision. Every wall one country builds is felt in the water of the next. The Danube does not recognise a border. Only the people on it do. Past the last of the great upper dams, the river changes its nature. The mountains release it, and it spills out onto the Great Hungarian Plain, a vast flat lowland where the Danube slows and widens and begins to wander. The steep alpine torrent becomes a broad, brown, easy river, looping across a floor of its own silt, more than a kilometre wide in places. This is the Middle Danube, and it behaves like a different creature. Where the upper river fell fast enough to spin turbines, this one barely falls at all. Its power is no longer in its speed, but in its sheer volume, and in the flatness of the land it can flood. The dams grow fewer. The floodplain grows enormous. It is on this slow, wide, silt-laden stretch that the river does its quietest and most essential work. Not making power now, but supplying water, carrying grain, and soaking into the ground beneath the cities. Which brings us to the water you drink. Downstream, the river reaches Budapest, 2 million people, a capital built on both banks, split by the current down the middle. Ask where that city gets its drinking water, and the obvious answer is wrong. It does not pump the water off the surface of the Danube. The surface is full of everything a large river collects along 1,000 kilometres. Instead, the city drinks the river through the ground. Along 2 islands in the stream, Szentendre in the north, Csepel to the south, engineers sank rows of wells not into the river, but into the gravel of its banks. And the river, pressing down through that sand and gravel, seeps sideways toward the wells. The journey takes weeks. As the water travels through the aquifer, the sand strains out the particles, and the life in the gravel breaks down what remains. By the time it reaches the wells, the river has cleaned itself. Almost no chemistry required, just stone and patience. They call it bank filtration, and it means that beneath the visible Danube runs a second, hidden one, moving slowly through the gravel, purified, headed for the taps of a capital city. Here is the part that matters. Even when the surface of the river falls to almost nothing, when the water is far below its normal mark, that underground river keeps moving. The gravel is not just a filter, it is a reservoir, holding a vast volume of water that the eye never sees. This is the invisible river from the source returned. The water that slipped into the ground in a German forest is the same idea that keeps 2 million people in water hundreds of kilometres downstream. The wells are guarded, fenced, and classified in law as critical national infrastructure. Not the river, the wells. The point where the country reaches into the gravel and takes what it needs to keep the taps running. Not every city on the river solves the problem the same way. Upstream, Vienna made a different choice. Rather than drink the Danube at its door, it reached past the river entirely, running 2 great pipelines down from the limestone Alps, a day's flow away, to bring pure mountain spring water into the city by gravity alone. A capital on one of Europe's greatest rivers that decided in the end not to drink from it. It is a telling contrast. Budapest takes the river and lets the gravel clean it. Vienna leaves the river alone and fetches its water from the mountains. 2 cities a few hundred kilometres apart on the same water, each having decided for itself how much to trust the Danube with the most basic thing a city needs. Because for all that the river gives, the power, the cargo, the coolant, a large city thinks hard before it drinks straight from a stream that has already passed 1,000 kilometres of farms, factories, and other cities upstream. Power, water, and still the river has one more service to sell. The one written into the title. The one that gives Europe least room to fail. Because the Danube does not only turn turbines with its falling water, it cools the reactors that make a different kind of power entirely. Follow the river into Hungary to a town called Pax. Pax holds the country's only nuclear plant, 4 reactors. And to understand its bond with the river, you have to understand a simple, brutal fact about nuclear power. A reactor's fuel makes heat. That heat boils water into steam. The steam spins a turbine, and the turbine makes electricity. But after the steam has turned the turbine, it has to be cooled back into water so the loop can begin again. And cooling on that scale takes an enormous, ceaseless supply of cold water. Some plants build tall towers and recycle their coolant, losing only a little to the air. Pax does not. PAX uses what is called once-through cooling. It draws water straight out of the Danube, runs it through the machinery to carry the heat away, and returns it to the river a little warmer. Straight in, straight out. The river is the coolant. The town itself lives off the warmth. The hot water PAX pours back is piped into homes. The plant heats the place that surrounds it. Look closer at what the river is actually doing inside the plant. The spent steam arrives at a wall of thousands of thin metal tubes, the condenser. River water is pumped through those tubes in a cold flood. The steam meets the cold metal on the far side, gives up its heat, and falls back into water. That is the whole trick. The river, on the other side of a tube wall, is what turns the steam back into something the plant can boil again. Which sets two conditions, not one. There has to be enough water to pump, and that water has to be cold enough to take the heat. The second condition is the one people forget. A reactor cannot warm the river without limit. The water it returns goes back into a living river that other towns drink from and fish in. So, by law, it can be warmed only so much, and the river itself only so far. In a heatwave, the Danube is already warm before it reaches the plant. There can be plenty of it, and it can still be too warm to use. So the reactor can be starved two ways: by a river too low, or by a river too hot. Either one, and the safe move is the same: turn the reactor down. One of the most powerful machines people build, made to bow to the temperature of the water going past its door. It is an efficient design and a beautiful one, and it hides a single point of failure. Because a plant cooled by the river can only run while the river is there to cool it. And the river is not a constant. It rises with the snow melt and falls in a dry summer. Its level is that one number again, cubic meters per second, moving up and down through the year. When the flow drops far enough, the water grows too low and too warm to carry the reactor's heat away. And a reactor that cannot shed its heat cannot run at full power. It must throttle back, turn down. In the hardest years, shut a reactor off entirely and wait. So a country's electricity, the current in its wires, the light in its rooms, comes to rest on the depth of a river measured in centimetres. Romania sits in the same position, at a plant called Cernavodă, cooled the same way by the same river. Two nations, two nuclear plants, both drawing their coolant from a single moving thread of water shared with 8 other countries. This is what the title means. The power stations cannot live without the river. Not the pretty river of the waltz, the working river, measured every day, feared a little when it falls. And they are only the largest customers. Along the banks stand coal and gas plants pulling the same water to cool the same steam. Bulgaria's reactors at Kozloduy, Serbia's furnaces at Kostolac. Further upstream, in Germany, a plant at Gundremmingen ran on Danube water for half a century before it was finally switched off. Add them together, and a single river becomes one of the largest cooling systems and one of the largest power sources on the continent. All of it drinking from the same thread. All of it waiting on the same number. That reactor in Romania, Cernavodă, sits on.
A piece of the river that is not entirely natural.
Near its end, the Danube makes a long, slow loop north before it turns for the sea. For ships bound for the Romanian coast, that loop is a detour of hundreds of kilometers through the marshes of the delta. So, decades ago, they cut across it. The Danube-Black Sea Canal is a straight artificial channel driven through the high ground that lets a barge leave the river and reach the port of Constanța directly, shaving days off the run to the sea. It is one of the great earth-moving works of the last century, a valley dug across dozens of kilometers of rock and clay. It was built at a terrible cost. In its first attempt, under a hard regime, much of the digging was done by prisoners, worked in conditions that killed an unknown number of them. The place earned a grim name before it was ever finished. The water flows there now over ground that swallowed a great deal of suffering, and the reactor draws its coolant from that cut. So Chernovoda depends not only on the river, but on the man-made channel beside it, a second layer of engineering, keeping a nuclear plant supplied with cold water and a country supplied with a shortcut to the sea. The river is natural. Almost nothing about how Europe uses it is. Every reach of it has been dammed, diverted, deepened, or cut, until the line on the map and the machine on the ground are barely the same thing anymore. Power is only half of what the river carries. The other half is cargo. For centuries, moving heavy goods across a continent meant roads, and roads were slow and expensive and easy to cut. A river was better. Water carries weight almost for free. A single barge on the Danube can hold what would take 100 trucks to move by land. But the Danube had a flaw as a trade route. It flowed the wrong way. It ran east toward the Black Sea, while the great markets and ports of the west sat on a different river system entirely, the Rhine, running north to the sea. Between the two lay a low ridge of hills in Bavaria, a watershed. A few dozen kilometers of dry ground that split Europe's water in half and kept its two greatest rivers apart. The dream of joining them is very old. In the year 793, the Emperor Charlemagne ordered a canal dug across that ridge to link the Danube and the Rhine. Thousands of men worked the ground by hand. Rain and soft earth defeated them, and the ditch filled in, and the idea was set down for 1,000 years. It was finally finished in 1992. A canal 171 kilometers long, climbing the ridge through 16 locks, each lock a chamber that lifts a laden barge step by step over the high ground and down the other side. And with that last cut, the two river systems became one. For the first time, a barge could leave the North Sea at Rotterdam, travel the Rhine, cross the ridge through the canal, and follow the Danube all the way to the Black Sea. 3,500 kilometers of inland water, from one sea to the other, without ever touching an ocean. The grain of the Hungarian plains. Ore, building stone, fuel. It moves along this thread, slowly, cheaply, out of sight of the roads. Of all of it, the grain matters most. The plains of Hungary, Serbia, and Romania are one of the great breadbaskets of Europe. Flat black earth that grows far more wheat and maize than the people on it could ever eat. And the cheapest way to move a harvest that size to the wider world is to float it. Down the river, through the locks to the ports on the Black Sea and out. So the same flow that cools the reactors also carries the bread. When the river runs low and the barges must lighten, it is not only freight that slows. It is food, leaving the fields of half a dozen countries for the markets beyond them, waiting, like everything else on this river, on the depth of the water beneath a keel. But moving cargo on a river depends on the same thing everything else does: depth. A loaded barge sits low in the water. It needs a certain depth beneath the keel, along a marked channel, the whole length of the journey. And when the flow falls, the channel shallows. So in a dry season, the barges cannot carry a full load. They ride higher, half empty, or they wait at anchor for the water to come back. The grain slows on its way to the sea. And once again, it is that single number, the flow, deciding what the river can and cannot do. To understand that number, you have to understand the year. The Danube is not the same river in June that it is in October. It has a rhythm, set by the weather over 800,000 square kilometers of Europe. In spring, the snow of the Alps and the Carpathians melts and pours down the tributaries all at once, and the river runs high and fast, the season of floods. Through the heat of late summer, the mountains give up less, the rain thins, and the river falls toward its lowest mark, the season the barges dread and the reactors watch. Then the autumn rains come, and it rises again. And in a hard winter, the river does something the machine likes least of all. It freezes. The middle and lower Danube can ice over, first at the edges, then in drifting flows, until in a severe year the sheets jam together and lock the river solid. Ice stops the barges dead. It can pile against the pier of a bridge or the face of a dam with the weight of a slow avalanche. So fleets of icebreakers work the channel through the coldest weeks, grinding a path open, because a frozen river is a river doing none of its jobs at all. This is the thing the postcard leaves out. The blue ribbon of the waltz is a living, shifting body of water, high, low, and frozen by turns. And every machine hung on it has to ride that rhythm, taking what the river gives in the spring flood and bracing for what it withholds in the dry of late summer. There is a second face to this. The river is not only feared when it is low, it is feared when it is high. The Danube drains 800,000 square kilometers of Europe. When the snow melts fast, or the rain sits over the mountains for days, all of that water arrives at once, and the river rises out of its bed. Whole regions along it lie below the level of a flood. In Hungary alone, an area larger than many small countries sits lower than the river in flood. So the same dams that make the power also hold back the water. The reservoirs swallow the flood peak and let it out slowly. The dikes and levees along the banks are a wall the length of the river, built against the day the flow runs too high instead of too low. This is the strange bargain of the machine. The river must be kept in a narrow band, not too little, or the reactors starve and the barges stop. Not too much, or the cities drown. A thread held, always, between two kinds of failure. And every wall built to hold that thread takes something else away. Consider what a river carries besides water. It carries sediment, sand and silt scraped off 1,000 mountains, moving downstream in the current, grain by grain, over thousands of years. A dam stops that too. The sediment settles behind the wall and never moves on. And the river below the dam, running clear and hungry, begins to cut into its own bed to find the load it has lost. At the far end of the river, this arithmetic comes due. The Danube's delta, the great fan of marsh where it finally meets the sea, was built over ages from sediment the river laid down. Starve the river of sediment, and the delta stops growing. In places, the sea begins to take it back. The machine that lights the cities is, slowly and quietly, unbuilding the land at the river's mouth. And there is one more thing the walls stopped: a fish. The beluga sturgeon is one of the oldest creatures in these waters, a giant that has swum the Danube since before there were cities on it. For thousands of years, the sturgeon ran up the river from the Black Sea to spawn, traveling astonishing distances inland, as far once as Vienna. Then the dams went up, and the great gates across the river, built to make power, became a wall the fish could not pass. The sturgeon's road up the Danube ended at a slab of concrete. The runs that had climbed the river for 10,000 years reached the barrier and stopped. These were not small fish. The largest of them, the beluga, could grow longer than a car and outlive the people who caught it. A creature out of an older world, moving up the river in the dark to lay its eggs on gravel it had used for 100 generations. You cannot build a stairway for a fish like that. The small ladders that help a salmon climb a low weir are useless against a wall 60 meters high, and useless for a body that size. The dam is simply the end of the road. So the wild runs collapsed. What the nets had thinned, the concrete finished, cutting the fish off from the gravel it had to reach to breed. Now, the survival of the oldest animal in the river depends on people raising the young in tanks and carrying them past the dams by hand, releasing them below the walls their ancestors used to swim straight through. The machine kept the lights on. It could not keep the sturgeon's road open. Some things, once walled, do not come back. The machine is not cruel. It was built by people trying to keep other people in light and water and bread. But it is total. It reorganizes everything the river touches: the flood, the sediment, the fish, the marsh, around the single task of holding that thread steady enough to use. Nowhere is that clearer than at the place where the river is squeezed hardest, and the largest machine of all was built. By the time the river reaches Belgrade, it is fully grown. Here it takes in the Sava, one of its greatest tributaries, and the two rivers join beneath the old fortress on the bluff. Serbia's capital sits in the fork between them, a city placed, like so many on this river, exactly where the water made a crossing worth holding and a trade worth taxing. Below the confluence, the Danube is carrying close to the most water it will ever hold. Everything upstream has arrived: the Inn, the Morava, the Drava, the Tisa, the Sava, 300 lesser rivers, the melt of 2 mountain ranges. This is the river at its full weight. And it is here, loaded with the drainage of half a continent, that it is about to be forced through the narrowest, hardest gate on its whole course. Downstream of Belgrade, the Danube runs into a wall of mountains. The Carpathians on one side, the Balkans on the other. And the river, which has spread a mile wide across the plains, is forced into a narrow gorge between them. A corridor of cliffs called the Iron Gates. For most of history, this was the most dangerous stretch of the entire river. The water, funneled between rock walls, ran fast and broken over hidden reefs. Boats were lost here for centuries. 2,000 years ago, the Romans tried to master it. They cut a road into the sheer face of the gorge, propping it out over the water on timber beams, so their legions could march the bank the river would not let them sail. And on the cliff above, they carved a tablet into the living rock, an inscription marking the road and the emperor who ordered it, Trajan, in about the year 100. The road was not cut to admire the gorge. It was cut to carry an army, to move the legions along a bank the river would not let them sail, on their way to the wars in the lands beyond it. And here the two ends of the story touch. When the Great Dam went up 2,000 years later, the rising reservoir drowned the old Roman roadbed. To save the tablet, they cut it out of the cliff, stone and all, and lifted it higher, resetting it on the rock above the new waterline, where it still looks down on the water that swallowed the road it was carved to mark. The gorge has been a place where power meets the river and tries to take it for 2,000 years. The tablet is just the oldest mark. The newest is the largest. In 1972, Romania and Yugoslavia finished a dam across the Iron Gates. And it is a machine on a scale the upper river never approached. The wall runs more than a kilometer from bank to bank, 60 meters high, holding back a reservoir that reaches upstream for over 100 kilometers. Set into it are 12 turbines, 6 on the Romanian side, 6 on the Serbian. And together, they generate more than 2,000 megawatts. It is the largest dam on the entire Danube, and one of the largest in Europe. And like every dam on the river, it had to let the ships through. So beside the turbines, they built locks, twin chambers, the largest on the whole Danube, each one lowering a laden vessel the height of a 10-story building in a single step, from the flat water of the reservoir down to the river below. The barges carrying the grain of the plains to the sea pass here, dropped through the wall a shipload at a time. So even the greatest machine on the river obeys the same 3-part bargain as the smallest. It makes the power, it holds the flood, it carries the traffic over itself. Only here, everything is at its largest. The wall, the reservoir, the 12 turbines, and the ships stepping down through the side. And it is run by 2 countries at once. The dam sits exactly on the border. The river down the middle is the line between 2 states. So the machine is split, its power divided evenly, its operation shared. two national grids drawing from one wall built across one river neither owns alone. A single piece of critical infrastructure straddling a frontier that only works if both sides keep their half turning. But to raise that reservoir, they had to drown what was already there. In the gorge, behind where the dam would stand, there was an island. It was called Ada Calais. For centuries, it had been its own small world, an Ottoman town in the middle of the river, with a mosque and a bazaar, narrow streets, a fortress, gardens where they grew tobacco and pressed the oil of roses. People had lived there for generations. It had outlasted empires. It sat in the current, apart from every country around it, and simply continued. The dam ended it. It is 1970. The gates of the new dam close, and the river, with nowhere to go, begins to rise behind the wall. The water reaches the lower streets of Ada Calais, and then the doors, and then the roofs. The people are already gone, moved off to the banks, resettled among strangers. The mosque goes under. The fortress goes under. The gardens, the streets, the whole island slip beneath the reservoir and do not come back. There is no lesson in it. The island was in the way of the water the machine needed, and so the island was erased. What stood for centuries was traded for what a turbine could make in a day. The water above it is calm now. Boats pass over the place where the streets were. Nothing marks it. This is what the machine costs, laid bare in one drowned town. Power on this scale is never free. Somewhere, always, something is under the water so that the lights can stay on. And now, at the largest machine on the river, every thread of this story finally pulls tight at once. Think about what the flow through the iron gates is doing at this single point. It is turning these 12 turbines, and every turbine on the 59 dams above them, all the way back to the Alps. It is the same water that will pass down to cool the reactors at Cernavodă. It is the water that seeped into the gravel to fill the taps of Budapest, hundreds of kilometers upstream. It is the depth under the keels of the barges carrying grain to the sea. It is the flood the levees are built against, and the sediment the delta is starving for. All of it. One river, one number. So imagine that number begins to fall. In a dry year, the flow drops. And it does not drop for one thing. It drops for everything, together, at once. The turbines here spin slower, and the power fades. Up the whole ladder, output falls with it. Downstream, the reactors that cool themselves in the river grow too warm to run and must be turned down or turned off. The barges rise in the shallows and stop, and the grain waits. The wells under the islands come under pressure as the underground river thins. The fields along the banks go dry. 10 countries. Power, water, food, and freight. All of it hanging on a single figure measured in centimeters, at 100 quiet points, on a river most of the world remembers as a waltz. That is the answer the title was pointing at. The power stations cannot live without the river, and neither, it turns out, can almost anything else. The Danube is not scenery with a machine bolted on. It is the machine. And the machine runs on one thread of water that no one, in the end, controls. Which leaves one last question hanging over the whole thing. If 10 countries all hang on one river, who runs the river? The answer is that no single country can. A dam held shut in one nation raises the water in the one above it and lowers it in the one below. A city drawing hard on the flow leaves less for the reactor downstream. A flood forming in the mountains of one country will in 3 days be cresting the levees of another. On a river like this, an action anywhere is a consequence everywhere. So the countries on the Danube have had to do the only thing that works: act on the river as one body. They share the measurements, the level and the flow, read at those 100 quiet stations, passed across borders as they happen. They warn each other of the floods coming down. They coordinate what the great dams release. The river is governed less like territory and more like a single organism whose organs happen to lie in different states. It is a quiet kind of achievement and an easy one to miss. 10 nations, many of them with long histories of not agreeing on much, keeping one river working. Because the alternative is that it works for no one. The Danube forces cooperation the way it forces everything else. Not out of goodwill, out of plumbing. The water does not care about the borders it crosses. It simply carries the fortunes of everyone downstream and waits to see whether they can agree on how to share it. And under all of it, the treaties, the dispatch rooms, the shared warnings, there is still just that number and someone reading it. All along the river stand gauging stations, some of them more than a century old, where the water's height and speed are measured and logged, hour after hour, and passed on. In control rooms in a dozen countries, people watch those readings the way a doctor watches a pulse. A slow line climbing in spring, sinking through the dry of summer, and every so often spiking toward a mark that means a flood is on its way. Because from that one figure, everything downstream can be foreseen. How much power the turbines will make tonight, whether the barges load full or sail light, how close the reactors sit to their limit, when a flood will reach a given city, almost to the hour. They are among the least known people on the river, and among the most important. Not the engineers who built the dams a lifetime ago, the ones who read the water now. Watching a number that decides, quietly, what a continent's morning will look like. And their whole task comes down to a single question, asked over and over in every season. How much river is there today? Follow that thread to the very end, and it lets go of everything at last. Past the iron gates, the mountains fall away, and the Danube spreads out one final time. It slows and splits and loses itself in a vast fan of reed and marsh and channel before it reaches the sea. The delta, shared between Romania and Ukraine, the largest and least spoiled wetland in Europe. Here, the river stops being infrastructure and becomes wilderness again. The channels wander. pelicans nest in numbers found almost nowhere else on the continent. For a moment, the water is nobody's coolant and nobody's cargo lane. It is just a river. Even here, though, the river is still working, at a task no engineer designed. The delta is its last filter. Everything the Danube gathered across 2,000 kilometers, the runoff of farms, the discharge of cities, the load of 80 million lives, slows in this maze of reed and channel, and the marsh strains much of it out before the water reaches the open sea. A wetland the size of a small country, quietly cleaning the river's account one final time. It is one of the largest reed beds on Earth, and one of the great gatherings of birds. Hundreds of species and pelicans in colonies found almost nowhere else on the continent. People live here too, in villages reached only by boat, fishing the channels as their families have for generations, cutting the reed for thatch and for paper. 3 great arms carry the river out through the delta. One of them, the Sulina, is kept dredged and straight so the ocean ships can reach the inland ports. The machine reaching even into the wilderness, holding one channel open for trade while the rest is left to wander. And then it is gone, poured out into the Black Sea, its work finished, its long descent from a German forest complete. Everything it carried on the way, the current in the wires, the water in the taps, the grain in the holds, it let go of, quietly, the way it took it all up,
without a sound, without being watched. We named this river for a waltz. We put it on postcards and sailed cruise ships down it and remembered it as something beautiful and idle. And all the while, out of sight, it was holding up the lights of a continent on a single number no song ever mentioned. The machine works. It has worked day and night for over a century. 4 capitals, 10 countries, a chain of reactors and dams and wells, all resting on one thread of moving water. And the thread is not a promise. It rises and falls with the snow and the rain, as it always has, answering to nothing. So the question the river leaves is a quiet one. Not whether the machine is clever, it is. Not whether it is beautiful, it is that too. But how much weight one thread of water can be asked to carry, and what we will do on the days it carries less. If these are the kinds of questions you like to sit with, the hidden systems that hold the ordinary world up, consider subscribing. There is always another one running underneath. Thank you for watching.